Parenting used to feel like a battleground, but making 5 small changes helped us turn a huge corner. These tiny practices shifted the tone in our home almost overnight, and they are all changes that I had control over. I'm sharing this because I know what it's like when it feels like every interaction you're with your kids turns into a power struggle. And these 5 shifts helped me to move out of constant conflict and back into building connection, guiding my kids with calm and clarity, and actually enjoying our time together. Some of you have been waiting for this video for a year, which is a long time, but I think it was the right amount of time for me to be assured that I am sharing tools that are sustainable and worthy of your consideration. So if you're ready for less conflict and more connection, let's get started. So today I'd say that 98% of the ideas that I'm going to talk about come out of the book Hunt, Gather, Parent. There's a few other influences that have played a role, but predominantly it is that book. So I'm going to start with a quick summary. The book follows the author as she spends time with 3 ancient cultures who are known for their ability to raise children who are kind, generous, cooperative, a lot of the qualities that we really hope to foster within our children in our culture. And the cultures are the Mayans, the Inuits, and the Hadzabe. Now, I assume that she observed many of the same parenting techniques within the different cultures, but in her structuring of the book, she focused on the specific strengths with each culture. For the Mayans, it was teaching helpfulness. For the Inuits, it was teaching emotional control. And for the Hadzabe, it was teaching confidence and mental wellness. And today we are going to focus on the lessons that she learned with the Inuits. I mentioned in this video that I had learned tools to teach children right from wrong without nagging or generating unnecessary conflict. So that's what we are going to dive into today. But up front, I want to say I can't cover it all in one video, so this might actually turn into a series. So if you like this video and it adds value for you and you'd like to see that series happen, be sure to hit the like button so that I know that that is something that I should continue to put energy toward. So the first thing we need to talk about is the steps to training a child. So during her time observing these cultures, the author of the book, whose name I forgot to say before, it's Michaeline Doucleff. Some people think that I am pronouncing her first name incorrectly. I don't know what to tell you. That's how she pronounces it. But she observed that there was a consistent approach to training children. So the first step is to allow plenty of opportunities to practice. The second step is to ensure you are modeling the desired behavior. And the third is to acknowledge growth and maturity in small doses. In these cultures, they avoid praise in the same way that we tend to do it in the West because they don't find it to be an effective motivator. So let me give you an example for the practice, model, acknowledge approach. The first step is to allow plenty of opportunities to practice. So anytime one of my kids comes into the kitchen and wants to help me with cooking or something that I'm doing in there, my answer is always yes. Even if it's going to slow me down, even if it's going to inevitably make the process a little bit more challenging or a little bit messier, I always find a way to include them, even if I have to break down what I'm doing into little subtasks. The second step is to ensure you're modeling the desired behavior. So for instance, if my child asks me for help in putting their shoes on, some parenting theories would suggest that I shouldn't say yes to that, especially if I know that they already know how to put their shoes on. I should instead encourage them to take responsibility for that because they already know how to do it and I don't want to infantilize them. Now, in the Mayan culture, they're more likely to say yes to that request because they do want to model that helpfulness. Now, I do think that this can be a little bit tricky. I would be cautious about always jumping in if my daughter was always asking me to put her shoes on when I know she's capable of it. What that might indicate to me is that she is also lacking confidence in her ability to do it. And so we might have to step back and reteach that skill just to make sure that the reason she's consistently asking for help is not because she's struggling with the skill itself. But if here and there she's asking for help, I'm absolutely going to say yes. I'm ready and happy to model helpfulness to her. The third step is to acknowledge, either by acknowledging their growth and maturity, here and there, not in a consistent all day laying on the praise, laying on the flattery, but also to accept their contribution. So the author gave an example with her daughter where she was wanting to help to skewer the kebabs, and the way the author was doing it is that she was doing kind of a mixture of meat and vegetables all on the same skewer, and her daughter wanted to put all meat on one skewer. And her initial reaction was to say, no, that's not how we do it. But then she ended up realizing that she wasn't accepting her daughter's contribution, and as a result, she was discouraging her daughter's desire to be helpful. And so she adjusted her approach, invited her daughter back to help, and accepted the contribution that she wanted to give, which is an all chicken skewer. And not only did it help to reignite that flame of desire to be helpful within her daughter, but it also turned out that they actually tasted better. So her daughter was right. So now that we know the steps to training a child, let's talk about the 5 changes I made in my parenting. I learned to quit yelling. So admittedly, I've never been a huge yeller, but it certainly is something that came out of me at times, and it's still something that comes out of me at times because sometimes I lose my patience and I don't always live up to best practices. Now that said, the basic idea with not yelling goes back to this concept of modeling. The Inuits argue that yelling doesn't teach children to behave, it teaches them to get angry. And one of the things that Duclef observed during her time with the Inuits is that their children have exceptional executive function skills. Executive function is a suite of mental processes that help you act thoughtfully instead of impulsively. So those of you who have like a child who's maybe a 2 or 3 year old and a child who's a 5 and 6 year old, you've probably already started to discern the difference in the executive function skills between those two children. I can see a huge difference in my 5-year-old's ability to control herself, to respond to disappointment, to consider other people versus where she was a couple of years ago. And some of the most consistent messages that Duclef got from the Inuit parents were things like, everything I said to them, I said in a calm voice. Or, when children are little, it doesn't help to raise your voice or get angry at them. It will just make your own heart rate go up, which I have personally experienced. Or, getting angry at a child has no purpose. It only stops communication between the child and the mom. What's interesting about the Inuits is that they view yelling at a child as demeaning both to the child and the adult. It's kind of the equivalent in their eyes of a grown-up tantrum. Laura Markham is the author of the book Peaceful Parent, Happy Kids, which I've never actually read, but she's referenced in Hunt, Gather, Parent. And she says that when we yell at children, we are training them not to listen. So the moment we yell at a child, we start to set a precedent where we're always going to have to yell, we're always going to have to raise our voice, and it becomes more and more harsh in order to continue to get their attention. So when I read this book, the big realization for me was that a lot of my behavior was actually teaching my children to get angry. And I've said this in the past, that when I called on more traditional parenting approaches, and by traditional I mean things that are traditional to my culture, I was really just teaching my children to get angry. And I saw the tension with my daughter and I just ratchet up and up and up. And that's not surprising, because going back to that practice, model, acknowledge approach, when I am modeling anger by yelling at my child, it is triggering anger in her, which she is then responding with yelling or with lashing out in some way. So she's getting lots of practice with anger. If I am then yelling back in return, I am now acknowledging her anger and returning it with more anger. And so now we have this perfect cycle, teaching or training a child to be angry. So then I had to ask myself, well, what do I want to be teaching them instead? Toddlers and babies and little kids, they're going to have big emotions, but they need to learn how to move through those and how to calm down. I also want them to learn how to have less anger, which meant that because a lot of it comes back to my modeling, is that the first thing I had to do was teach myself these things. I learned to stop talking. So what the author noticed is that the Inuits would typically respond to exasperating situations with children, which absolutely came up for them, they come up for everybody, by first pausing, saying nothing, and observing. Which to me, the practice of observing children, or the practice of observing in order to learn, was not a new idea. I'd read a lot about Montessori, and observation is a huge part of it. I would say it's kind of almost the central practice, because Maria Montessori was really focused on understanding the individual child in front of you, and that can only be done through observation of that individual child. So the way I approached it is that I took basically a 3-day hiatus from talking at all. Occasionally I would speak, obviously, but typically in an extremely low voice, like basically a whisper. And the author doesn't necessarily recommend that. She just says that, when you start to feel anger coming, she would sort of turn herself into stone, purse her lips together and just say nothing and quietly wait for the anger to pass. I think where I took the approach of not talking much for a few days was I felt so overwhelmed by just the full scope of advice that was in the book that I was kind of afraid to introduce any new tactics. And so instead, I took what to me was the easier route of decluttering all my parenting strategies, kind of put them in a temporary, maybe we'll use these in the future box, and I replaced them with silence, and it essentially gave our relationships a little 3-day reset. I had always been concerned with my children's moral development, but I realized that going 3 days without chastising bad behaviors or using timeouts or redirecting, it wasn't going to be the end-all be-all in terms of like shaping their moral character, and it would just give me a chance to kind of reset and rethink. And what I found was that doing this led to a noticeable shift in my kids' behavior, and it made me realize, like, okay, I'm actually seeing improved behaviors by me doing nothing versus all of the little interventions that I was trying to use before. And I realized also that by not talking, I had more time to be observing my kids, because kind of when we're just constantly going and jabbering away, like we really can't watch and see what's going on with them. So obviously my example is kind of like a bigger way than what the author is recommending. What she is saying is that when the Inuits experience an exasperating situation with a small child, they will first pause, say nothing, and watch what the child is doing. And it gives them a moment to first gather themselves emotionally, make sure that they don't lash out, but it also gives them a moment to learn what is going on, what is causing this response from the child, and what is an intervention that might work in this particular situation. And learn to walk away. One of the next things that Duclef learned from the Inuit was the importance of stepping away when choosing to be silent isn't enough in order to calm yourself down. Because again, this is a culture that doesn't want to model anger to their children. One of the women that she interviewed said, "When I feel anger coming, I leave the children or grandchildren alone." And there's a couple different advantages in this. For one, it is giving you that opportunity to calm yourself so that you can respond calmly to whatever is going on with the kids. For me, I often find myself saying in my head, "Dear Lord, please give me your heart for my children." He is more just, he is more merciful, he has significantly more patience than me, and sometimes I need a little supernatural boost. It also has this double effect that I really love, which is it communicates non-verbally that their behavior is not acceptable, which nonverbal communication can be incredibly powerful with small children, often much more so than verbal communication. And for me, this was really important, and one of the reasons I really liked this book. I know that permissiveness is not in my child's best interests. I do want to be communicating to them what is socially acceptable, what is right, what is wrong, what is just, but what this book taught me and what the wisdom of these different cultures taught me is that I don't need to control their behavior in the exact moment or get the ultimate result I want in that moment. I can communicate with nonverbals that how they're behaving is not acceptable, and I can trust that with other interventions, the executive function will develop, but that's a long-term process. In fact, it's a process that goes into their mid-20s. So I realized, okay, it is okay if when I start off with teaching my children right from wrong, if the only person who is behaving acceptably is me. I learned to tell different stories. So those last couple of lessons are all about learning to use nonverbals, and they're very much about controlling my behavior with my kids. But the next couple of lessons are about learning to have less anger in the first place. So the author makes a point that this is not about suppressing anger, but is actually about generating less anger. And a lot of this comes from a shift in perspective about our kids. So for Western parents, we tend to tell ourselves a specific story, which is that kids are acting out in order to be manipulative, in order to push our buttons. But the author wrote, "Do we really know if toddlers and young children manipulate us the way that adults manipulate? That children push our buttons the way that adults push buttons? There's no scientific evidence that suggests either of these statements is true. There are no brain scans in which the manipulating circuitry lights up when toddlers misbehave. There are no psychological studies in which 2-year-olds come clean and admit, yes, all they want to do is enrage mom and dad." So the author then suggests that these ideas about the motivations of young children are stories that we tell ourselves. And Inuit parents tell themselves different stories. Inuit parents tell themselves tales that make it easier to keep a cool head around little children and to have less anger toward them. I learned to expect misbehavior. Now, I want to be clear that this isn't about condoning misbehavior, just setting our expectations to be aligned with their skill level. Inuit parents expect children to have poor executive function and poor emotional control, and they see it as their job to teach children these skills. And this can be compared to the way that Western parents understand that a child cannot automatically read or do math. There's an anthropologist named Jean Briggs who I think in the 1960s lived among the Inuits to study and learn their culture, and she wrote that they expect children to be easily angered and to cry easily when disturbed because they have no ihuma, no mind, thought, reason, or understanding. I think that this adapted expectation creates an essential emotional and psychological boundary for the parent who might otherwise take their child's outburst personally or see it as a reflection of their parenting. And I said 5 lessons at the beginning, but I was wrong. There's 6. So the 6th one is I stopped arguing, negotiating, and nagging. I want to start with this quote. "Even when a child mistreats you, you don't fight back with a young child. Just leave the point alone. Whatever is wrong, eventually the behavior will get better. And the author observed this attitude across all cultures. Like, the parents just do not engage. I was reading in Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Going back to the book, in the context of these different cultures, what the author observed is that parents will make a request of their child and then they wait silently for compliance. Or, they might make a little comment or just walk away, turn their attention somewhere else. One example in the book is the author went to observe a mother of 4 get her children ready and out the door for school, which tends to be a very high tension time for a lot of families. What she observed was that it wasn't a high tension time for this family. They moved very seamlessly together. But one of the things she observed the mother do is she said to her son, I don't know what his age was, but she said to her son, go put your shoes on. Very non-emotional, just a clear direction. He kind of walked out of the house and then came back a few minutes later, didn't have his shoes on. The mom didn't say anything, which really surprised the author. A few minutes later, she said, oh, Ernesto, your shoes. He walked out of the house once again, a few minutes later returned, still no shoes. The author again expected the mom to have a reaction. Again, nothing. A few minutes later, the mom said again, Ernesto, your shoes. And this time he went out of the house and came back and he actually did have his shoes on. And, in that example, the mom just modeled calmness. She didn't choose to argue. She didn't choose to raise her voice. She didn't really nag. She gave a lot of time in between each request, like at least 5 minutes in between each request. And going back to the steps to train a child, if you argue, they get to practice arguing. If you negotiate, they practice negotiating. If you nag, they practice nagging. So this is part 1 of 2, maybe 3 videos on this subject of training our children in understanding right from wrong, in being able to control themselves emotionally, developing those executive function processes, and helping them to cultivate those characteristics of kindness, helpfulness, generosity, cooperation, emotional control, confidence, all of those characteristics that we as parents aspire to guide our children toward. You'll notice that this one focused entirely on the mindsets and behaviors of us, the parents. That really comes down to those steps to training a child. Practice, model, acknowledge. If we don't have a handle on what we're modeling, if it's a lot of anger, arguing, nagging, whining, which honestly, I didn't have that much self-awareness around it and how I was doing it until I read this book. If we don't have a handle on what we're modeling, we're gonna have a really hard time with getting them to practice the behaviors that we want to cultivate within them. So a quick recap of the lessons learned today. First, we train a child by modeling the desired behavior, giving them opportunities to practice, and acknowledging in small doses by accepting their contributions and occasionally making reference to their growth and their maturity in their overall behavior, but not by heaping on flattery and praise. Number 2, take some time to reflect on the mindsets that could be influencing how you respond to your kids. Number 3, consider the behaviors that you are modeling that could be influencing what your children are modeling in return. I've said this in the past, that children have a tendency to give a crude approximation of the behaviors that they see from us. And so it might look a lot bigger and more obnoxious coming from your kids, but it's very likely a reflection of something that they have seen from you and are attempting to mimic in their own crude way. And 4, pick one simple change to make. I started with silence. Like I said at the beginning, changing my behavior has had a huge impact on my family. I have read quite a few parenting books, and most you get 1 or 2 ideas, but often you're missing enough context for it to be useful, and a lot of it ends up being kind of wishy-washy nonsense. But I have narrowed things down to 3 books that I think are fantastic. And if you'd like to learn more about those, check out this video here. And until next time.